this time last night, we all expected Hillary Clinton to sweep Mississippi and Michigan, and it didn't go that way. Even though every poll out of Michigan showed Hillary up by more than 20 points, some had her within 11 or 12. Bernie ended up eking out a win, won by 2 points. Some people are comparing it to the New Hampshire Democratic primary in 2008 where Hillary upset Obama. But even then, Obama was leading by about 8 points and lost by 3. In this case, almost every poll conducted in Michigan had Bernie down by 20. Josh, have you ever seen any race where that was 20 points apart the day before and swung that dramatically on Election Day?
No. In fact, I think that it was Nate Silver of 538 who said last night that if Bernie wins, this represents perhaps the biggest public polling failure in history of the practice, which makes sense. And I feel like that, of course, as something for Bernie supporters to be mad about. The story isn't so much that Bernie won, which is amazing, but it's, how did this happen? Because he was, so much of the conventional wisdom suggested that Hillary Clinton was going to win this one easily. There's some cool theories like, the fact that Bernie just campaigned so hard in the state. There were areas in outside of like Flint and Detroit where the Sanders campaign went 5-6 times. Hillary Clinton didn't even show up at all. There were also reports of people saying that they would have voted for Hillary, but because they thought she had it in the bag, they went and cast anti-Trump votes because it was an open primary. And then there's also the fact that the debate happened Sunday night. All the polls ended Sunday. The debate happened Sunday night, and it was a really big debate. Even though I don't know, I kind of felt like it was a pretty typical debate, but apparently it had an incredible effect because it swung some people in Bernie's camp who might not have been there otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to envision that the debate had that much of an impact, though. In 538, which you mentioned, they gave Bernie like a 99% chance of losing Michigan the night before. Peter, why do you think the polls got it so wrong, considering early on, I mean, even in hard-to-poll places like Nevada, we saw fairly bad polling firms still come in with pretty reliable numbers?
Yeah, I mean, you've got to look, I think, deeper into how these polls are conducted. And I don't know the details of how these particular polls were, but a lot of them still are based on landline phones. And that clearly does not connect, double pun, to Bernie's core supporters, mostly young people who are probably cell-based. So that's one question. Second, I think a lot has to do with the nature of these polls. Who's going to give straight-up answers? Who's going to get on the phone and answer and respond to these things? Again, cell phone people oftentimes are very wary about taking calls from numbers they don't know. So I think some of it may have to do with the technology. If they do more internet-based polling, I think that may be more useful. If they did more social media analysis, that may get at some of these things. But be careful that we blame the polls too much. It may be, in fact, that people were, in fact, shifted and convinced by some of the things they heard in the debate, which were amplified out over the next 24, 36 hours.
Still, it's hard to envision that big a swing just from one debate, and it's hard to see how none of the polls picked up any kind of trend moving towards Bernie.
Well, one mistake that Peter didn't mention, I think, is just, and you can finish with your thought in a moment. I just want to say that polls always go after likely voters, and Bernie won with a lot of unlikely voters. So I think that's part of the reason too. A huge chunk of his support base was just they weren't even asked the question.
Yeah. And so,
go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, a combination of polling, a combination of out-of-date technology, and throw in a few minds that were changed by the information in the debate. The debate itself was one thing, but the stuff about Hillary lying about Bernie's position on the auto bailout, for example, that kind of information, in a state like Michigan, that's the issue that people follow, and that kind of stuff moves very quickly through the system.
Yeah, well, I mean, turnout had a big part to do with it. Voters under 30 made up more than 20% of the voters last night. Independents made up more than 20% of the voters last night. Those are the groups he usually does well with. He crushed her among voters 18 to 44 by a 67 to 32 margins. One independents, one those making under 100,000. But unlike the Southern poll numbers we've seen, he won 35% of the black vote, which is not great, but considerably more than we've seen in like Mississippi and Louisiana and Georgia, where she's winning with like 80% of by 80%. So, we talk about the black vote a lot. And Peter, why do you think Hillary failed to win over her typical amount of black supporters in Michigan compared to the places in the South where she's just... Yeah, go ahead.
To be quite honest, I've never fully understood the support of African Americans for Hillary Clinton. And I'd very much like to hear you guys' thoughts on that. But from what I do understand, there's a couple of things that help her appeal to African American voters. One of which, again, I'm just pulling this stuff off the internet. I have no black friends whatsoever to ask about these things. And when I stop people on the street, I just, they say, "Are you a cop? Well, what's up?" But seriously, two things keep coming up in the stuff I've been able to kind of parse out. And one is that a lot of African American voters are upset by Bernie's quote unquote attacks against Obama, and that their loyalty to America's first black president and the woman who serves essentially as his vassal in this election, Hillary, there's some connections there. The other, and this may be more applicable in Michigan, is that Hillary has put in a lot of groundwork on African American voters. She shows at South Carolina, for example, she showed up at a lot of churches, a lot of small events, whereas Bernie has not been doing that in the African American community, though his people apparently did do a lot more outreach, small scale outreach, but a lot of it in Michigan. So that may have something to do with it. We might as well just throw in the idea that when we kind of throw together this concept of all African Americans, it's pretty disingenuous to group that large a group of folks into one sort of bucket.
Well, certainly we expected younger black voters to go for Bernie, but we didn't really see that in the South, where, again, she would win with like 90% of the black vote. And here you see that she only got about 65%. Joshua, she made Flint one of the big kind of top points in her campaign, spent a lot of time in Michigan. Why do you think she won so much less of the black vote here, considering that would have pretty much put her over the top?
Well, unlike Peter, I am beloved in the black community, who I can assure you love to be referred to as, yes, they're a hat-loving group of people, and they love to be talked about as like one giant monolithic group. It's their favorite.
By three white guys. Yeah, I know.
Yes. I think there were two things about Hillary Clinton, about Hillary among black voters and why it shifted a little in Michigan. And there's the support from black voters, I think, actually comes from, what everyone thinks it comes from, which is just the history that the Clinton family itself has as kind of a champion of causes important to black voters. We love to look back in hindsight at the 1994 crime bill and the disastrous 96 welfare reform. Both of those things really, really sucked. At the time, they weren't as controversial as they are now. So that's, it's a little disingenuous to sort of paint the crime bill as like this obviously bad idea that was going to balloon mass incarceration when it really wasn't. Maybe it was and people just weren't listening, but again, that wasn't sort of
the crime bill,
how people felt about it at the time.
Yeah, the crime bill was passed at a time where, we really did have one of the worst crime epidemics that this country's ever seen. And even that, it increased incarceration among federal prisoners. If we released every federal prisoner tomorrow, we'd still have more than 2 million people in state and local prisons. So it really
right. I think it's like 0.2% prison reduction if we released every federal prisoner. And the other thing too is, remember, Hillary Clinton was the first lady, and during Bill Clinton's term, the first, or any president's term, the first lady does all the bullshit. Like, they go out to the communities and they shake the hands and they're there saying, look at how lovely this place is, or this lovely person, and this is my car. So, CHIP was a big deal. Got a lot of kids insured. Hillary Clinton went to a lot of these neighborhoods in South Carolina, in Illinois. So they saw her there as the first lady in the neighborhood, and that is a powerful sort of image to folks, that that the first lady is there, and it brings a kind of spotlight that up until that point Americans weren't really used to seeing, Black Americans specifically. Now to Detroit or to Michigan, I think two things that happened was, one, Michigan is unique in that trade and class and economics even trumps race in that state, because they were once, the Bahrain of the Midwest because of the auto industry. They're just rolling in money, and now it's a proverbial ghost town. So I think the trade, NAFTA, things like that had a lot to do with it. So Clinton's attack on Sanders, plus her tricky history with trade anyway, might have fucked her a little in that end of things. And then to the debate answer that Bernie Sanders gave about poverty, and the one he got tagged on for saying white people don't know how to be poor, that was how white people heard it. A lot of more progressive-minded folks and some of my actual, Black friends who I talk to about politics noticed that was one of the first times they had ever heard a major candidate for any office acknowledge, even if not explicitly, the existence of white privilege. And that went, I think, a long way towards making the kind of inroads that up until now Bernie Sanders seemed incapable of making with voters outside of his economic message. So it'll be interesting to see if Sanders is able to, maintain that kind of campaign style into Ohio, Pennsylvania, and some of these other contests, because, it's really a ball game now.
Yeah, it's interesting
Bernie did make the labor union stance on the TPP, NAFTA trade a really big part of this campaign in Michigan, which we really haven't seen that much coming in. So now, like Josh said, we're going to Ohio, we're going to Illinois, Missouri. Peter, does this make you think that maybe he does have a chance in these Rust Belt Midwest states next Tuesday?
Absolutely. I think what, Josh was touching on a very important point, and that is people's identity, if you will, is made up of different factors. And in places like South Carolina, race is a predominant part of someone's identity. Black, white, things like that. It goes back to a long history of racial discrimination, things like that. But when you get to Michigan, people's identity may be made up of different points, and at some level, the concept of blue collar, the people who were screwed over by NAFTA, people who lost their jobs overseas, that identity may in fact push past race. If that is accurate, then that puts Bernie in a very positive place coming up to states like Pennsylvania and Ohio, and to a certain extent Illinois, where people were burned over in the 1990s by the same forces that burned over Detroit and larger Michigan. That bodes well for Bernie in those places, and it'll be very interesting to keep an eye on that, particularly among groups like African Americans or evangelicals, or pick the group that you want and see if they stress that identity or in fact go with the industrial, the blue collar, or the persons left behind when the economy moved in a different direction.